Deliverance and Thunder. Churning through the manufactory work was my purpose here, Retha. Churning as a paddle might churn through milk, constant, restless and relenting only when the job was done and our masters, so-called, whipped us away to sleep. They never smiled or showed any real emotion, these enhanced monsters, other than a base, endless anger. Some had clubs and flails, and all of them had distended mouths with black gums and altogether too many teeth, which stank, hanging below a metal faceplate. In all my years here, I never heard any of them utter a word. Nothing beyond grunting and the occasional howl. The whips were electrified slightly and haphazardly grafted to the arms of our captors. Just another chance for one of our dimensional overlords to experiment with their technologies, I suppose, and needless, as the size of our jailers and their enhancements meant that often they would detach a limb from one of us out of sheer carelessness, with the whip alone. I wondered at this, what the point was, other than to terrify us. It confirmed the malignancy of the minds in control of this minor hell. The whips left a smell when they were used on skin, you know. A smell like the meat substitutes we used to compress together and roast on our special days. Before. The days of our birth, the days of our deaths. The days of the coming together of two peoples to begin their coupled journey as a burgeoning family. There are no special days now, but the scent remains. I used to be a scientist before this, what you would call a chemist and something of a biologist also. I was constantly reminded of my decline being forced to work here. So much time wasted. We made explosives, or rather the component chemical portions, which these slavers and the monsters above turned into the real thing, in secure laboratories for their constant warring beyond the walls. If we had access to them, we would have used them on the whole system we were enslaved to, ourselves included. It was terrible work. I was lucky, you could say, to have what the masters so feared in their slaves locked carefully inside my mind. A free will and a touch from the open ink sky as we used to know it. I could change things, even back then. I could change the pain of those whips by deflecting their path slightly. Only slightly. I could pull someone out of the path of the monster's charge when their chemical injectors failed, or prevent machinery from crushing someone. I couldn't use it as much as I would have. The spider type on the gantry above our work pit could sense any real disturbance in what I now know was a channel through the warp. I kept some alive who should have died. I could have done more. Even then, but with 1,000,000 broken monsters within arm's reach, I would have been murdered thrice over before I had crushed even 2 or 3 of them. I waited. I survived, and I waited. Years I spent in cages there. Longer than anyone else who was captured and kept. There were times when I was beaten, crushed. I have vague memories of the horror of losing my arms, and in others my legs, or having my stomach pulled open by our guards, and once even being strangled, excruciatingly slowly, before something in my throat broke, and I always would wake somewhere unfamiliar. In my attempt to find an exit, I always ended up back here where I had come from, and assumed my mind was wandering, trying to keep itself sane. I know better now. We heard no rumors. We had no contact with anyone outside our pits of metal and meat. The sulfurs, magnesium powders, potassium nitrates, and on would be lowered through the roof, so high up you could barely see, and we would go about the business of mixing them, and mixing them, and mixing them. There were times when some of the new slaves would hide amongst the empty boxes on the lift, and, thinking their freedom about to be regained, start the final rise to the opening and the light above, that could have been sunlight in another time. The vaguely female psychics, with all of the legs arrayed like a Hindu god of old Earth, would always know. They would watch them rise and rise. Then they would drop the whole thing, hundreds of meters, and we would hear them scream their final breath onto the stone and steel. The slaves who had been there long enough ran for their cages as soon as the lift began to drop. The ones who hadn't seemed always to try to get to the edge of the room there, and every time were pulverized by the compacting air and concussion of the lift's final thunderous stop. I never thought it unusual that the lift always remained untouched by its misuse and never in need of repair. But the Red Room. That room was cleaned all too thoroughly by its starved inhabitants. I hated it here. Not in the sense that I yearned for freedom or wished for these barbarous natives to receive some form of comeuppance. I was not that naive. I still grew up on the waste above. I knew what it meant to break out, and it wasn't the lush green pastures and cool waters of what our new master grew to manhood in. No, what depressed me beyond everything else was the insane heat and repetitiveness of our captors. Even the brutality, though effective, was just that. Brutal, unchanging, uninspired, and it seemed that was all they needed. I was a keen student of history before my enslavement, and held to the principle of entropy of empire for my sanity. Everything wanes and decays, Retha, or is overtaken by the new. At some point, something had to happen to change our gridlocked existence. I clung to that. I know now that I was inside these vaults for 102 years. I never seemed to age, nor did anyone else, but then they never lived for very long. We were on our sleep cycle when we felt a different thunder than the machines we knew. It was rhythmic. It matched our own trudge to work in some ways, but louder, far away and with a cadence we couldn't ever muster. Our jailers became agitated. They foamed, and some had flecks of blood spattering their chests from under their metal masks as they paced back and forth. The spider creatures mewed and chirruped and screeched and scratched at their mutated heads. We knew something was happening here, something that I hoped could change the constant droning thud of each day being forced onto the next. It came on louder, as though we were in a cave and all the seas of old Earth rolling towards us. One crash after another, and another, and another. Our jailers, those disgusting conglomerations of metal and disgraced flesh, started to run to the lift opening, smashing aside anything in their path in their attempts to escape. The lift wasn't there. They howled beneath their masks, and a few tried to rip them from their faces, with no regard for the bolts which held them to their skulls. It began. A shrieking sound like irradiated wind through the mountain passes ended with the stone beneath bucking and shaking us from our feet, as whatever was flying above landed. The waves still crashed on. They never relented, not for 1 second. The shrieking weapons of our captor's new adversary kept on coming, until a number of us in our pits were being sick from the concussions and bleeding from the ears. A few of the weaker of us died, unable to cope with the body's concussion from whatever was going on up there. It stopped as it had started, suddenly and with perfect synchronization, and there were the waves on the rocks over our heads again. Louder this time and closer, but just as adamant. A beat started over the waves now. Constant metallic snaps like a chain blade accompanying the drumbeat of the waves rolling on. It was terrifying in its inflexibility. I thought it must be an arrangement of great earth-moving machines brought to pull down the walls of our... what should I call it now? Hive? Manufactorum? I know now that in fact it was something far more powerful, more dangerous. The crash grew, and then of a sudden silence overwhelmed us, and the fear that had been building this whole time in the slave pen started to overflow into violence between us. Can you imagine? Years of those mangled freaks killing us and maiming, and we took to murdering each other. Human nature. I managed to back myself to the bars and forced a hole in them large enough to escape. Others followed, back out into the machine area and towards that accursed lift. The silence was starting to wane. I could hear thumps and muffled noises coming from the heights above me, and sickeningly deep laughter occasionally punctuating the bangs of guns and the wet smacks of closer combat. The lift started to descend. Not in its malicious drop designed to thwart those who still courted freedom, but casually, almost gently. The things built to keep us in went berserk at this, and started trying to climb each other to reach the bottom of the lift as it came, creating a pyramid of their own still living bodies. The spiders were beside themselves, agony starting to build until more than one of them died. Their eyes burst and their heads smoked. I could feel it then, a deep pull in my skull. Not unpleasant, but a force of the warp unmistakable and totally unresistible. It forced me to kneel down within the group staring at the monsters attempting to gain the lift. When it reached the ground, I could just make out armored boots begin their march to the lift's outskirts and realize the source of the crashing waves. A scream which made my ears ring burst forth from the savages as bangs of incredible ferocity shook the air around us, even at this range. My comrades scattered, leaving me alone and on my knees, wishing for a painless death so that I didn't have to endure any longer. The movement revealed giant men, not monsters, at least as big as the freakish things we had been subjected to. Brass or bronze-colored armor, and great red crests on their helms. They moved slowly outward, but brought with them a violence I had never thought possible from men as seemingly untwisted as the ones we were so accustomed to. Their adversaries rushed them, howling through their masks as if begging to be freed from their existence. These men obliged. Guns, quickly empty of ammunition, were discarded on their straps and replaced in hand by weapons of a much more personal bent. I saw one of the jailers leap fully in the air from the body of a decapitated ally and bring down one of the brass-clad to a rolling fight where they wrestled on the ground, stabbing and biting, until a few more of the brass-clad obscured my view and dismembered it with powered saws. Another I saw grasped by the back of the neck, and the warrior, laughing in a way I will never forget, pulled the thing's spine and augmented pistons straight out of its neck for daring to attempt violence on its fellows. Their powered saws moved back and forth, blowing flesh apart rather than cutting, and through tears I begged my legs to move that I might carry myself away from this new horror. Stamped into the ground, obliterated by close-range explosions, pulled apart and torn in every way, these men and our abominable slavers fought each other to ruin. I didn't realize so much blood had a smell so strong it was more a feeling, a heavy vinaigrette. Those swords, I suppose we would call them, fountained liters of the stuff through the air, all over their comrades, and them doing the same in return. More than the noise, more than the smell and the disgusting demolishment of the bodies of those slavers, what panicked me more was the glee these men took in the application of their particular brand of violence. They appeared to love it, as their own brothers fell in turn, and when it was all over, they seemed lost, like a group of children popping the last of a stream of bubbles. It made me very afraid, Retha. I am not ashamed to admit it. Be thankful you will never see their like again. They began to migrate towards me, following their leader. I couldn't tell. The ones in the back started firing into the bodies they'd already destroyed, making me buck around. Through the bangs, this behemoth approached me, kneeling on the floor. The closest of his fellows spitting blood and shards of bone out of his mouth. Their injuries were terrible to behold, but it seemed to have had little effect on their ability to move. I had hoped that they would bypass me. He said something I couldn't make out, through the banging that was deafening me. He gestured back and the noise stopped, eventually, leaving a silence filled with the heavy breathing of giant lungs. I remember that quite clearly, Retha. His voice was impossibly deep, and mixed with the whine in my ears, I almost couldn't make out what he was saying. I looked into a face half covered with a tinted visor, and he tried again.
Aryan. Are you Aryan Delin?
I told him I was, though I can't remember speaking. He glanced up to the top of the lift, where a warmth and that force in my mind seemed to radiate from, and turned back down to where I was knelt.
By your old masters you have been misused, Aryan. The Emperor of Mankind is waiting for you.